Hello, good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to the Shiplake community, whether you're watching live or referring to the recording. This webinar is intended to give parents in the wider Shiplake community an overview of our work as a thinking school, what this means, what this looks like for our pupils, how it benefits their learning, and where we are on our journey. So my name is Paul Jones. I'm Deputy Head Academic, and I've been part of this work from the start. I'm joined this evening by one of our assistant heads, Mr. Sam Shaw, and between us, we'll aim to share the work that's been taking place at the college and what the pupils have been experiencing in their lessons. So I'll provide some of the background information, and Mr. Shaw will bring to life some of the science of learning and how our brains work. And he's a psychology teacher, and he's very well qualified for this part. And we'll also provide some examples of pupils' work. So without further ado, since September 2022, Shiplake College has been working very closely with the company Thinking Matters, and we are proudly part of the Global Thinking Schools Network. Had a meeting with the CEO today. Our work is being led by a small team of teachers from across the college, known as our Drive team. And the picture you can see on screen there is the result of our first meeting with Thinking Matters back in September 2022. As a college, we are ultimately working towards thinking school status, accredited by Exeter University. However, far more importantly, we aim to explicitly teach all pupils about their thinking, an essential skill for academic success, and to prepare them for whatever their futures may hold. Moving on, what is a thinking school? So a thinking school is a learning community in which teachers and pupils have a deep understanding of how to learn effectively. It's also a school where effective questioning is used to promote higher order thinking. It's a school where thinking is made visible across every subject and across every year group. It's a place where pupils develop a knowledge of the brain and of themselves as learners. It's also a place where pupils are encouraged to think reflectively, critically, and creatively. And most importantly, all of this work is evidence informed. It's informed by a rich body of academic research. So, what is metacognition? It's essentially thinking about thinking. And by making this explicit, we'll help pupils to deconstruct the process of thinking, thereby giving them the tools to approach any problem with confidence. Metacognition also includes self-regulation, the process by which pupils plan, monitor, and evaluate their work and their learning behaviors in pursuit of a specific goal or target. And a focus on metacognition helps pupils to become independent learners. And based on the research, this approach has been shown to add the equivalent of an additional 7 months worth of academic progress. And that's based on the research of the Education Endowment Foundation from their 2017 report. Why are we doing this at Shiplake College? So, in addition to the benefits I've just outlined, there are some compelling reasons why we have chosen to embark on this journey. The research shows that embracing the work of a thinking school has the greatest impact on pupils' learning with very little cost. And you can see that on the diagram on the screen. And of course, this keeps the bursar happy. A 2022 action research project at the college, and as part of our staff-led learning research group, showed that knowledge of metacognitive strategies had a positive impact on the outcomes of pupils who are part of our core learning development program. And it's widely acknowledged that effective SEN teaching is effective teaching for all pupils. And that's on the next slide. And we've also introduced, I think there's the little thing there, Mr. Shaw. Thank you. So that's just the Learning Research Group findings. And on the next slide, we've introduced various strands of this work over the years. The creation and promotion of our very own Shiplake 7, more about that later. The college's work with neighbouring schools and the Brain Can Do Foundation. And becoming a thinking school will have the greatest impact on our pupils' progress and will prepare them for whatever challenges their future holds. Research by the University of Exeter on the attainment and progress in thinking schools has shown that pupils from accredited secondary thinking schools in the UK show the equivalent of a GCSE grade increase against those starting at the same point at non-thinking schools. So again, compelling evidence. And another important part of this for us, in a future rich with AI, nothing will be more important than the ability to think and to think creatively. As we all know, there are enormous possibilities with knowledge transfer from sort of tutor bots, teacher bots, language learning models. However, it's what we do with this information, how we think critically and evaluate and analyze this information that will be the most important skills valued by employers in the future. On the screen, you can see the Shiplake 7. So since 2015, the Shiplake 7 has represented the key skills and qualities the college has promoted throughout pupils' academic and co-curricular journey. And through the college's work with thinking matters, it was clear that there was a natural crossover with the habits of mind based on the work of Costa and Calick. Therefore, the Shiplake 7 is now firmly positioned as our common language of the classroom, and we refer to these dispositions regularly and what the pupils need in order to be determined and open-minded. And next, the culture. So Thinking Matters provides this very useful visual representation of the different pillars of life at a thinking school. As you can see, everything is based on sound academic research, and to embed this culture, the following needs to be in place: a common vision, a common language, and common tools and strategies. And I've alluded to some of these already. But on the next slide, there's the vision statement. And before I hand over to Mr. Shaw, perhaps you'd indulge me as I share our vision statement with you. And this has been devised by our Drive team, that team of colleagues who are leading this work. So at Shiplake College, we want to ensure that our pupils are fully prepared for the uncertainties, demands and challenges of their future pathways. Through the Shiplake 7, we want our pupils to adopt a problem-solving approach where they are given the tools to build resilience, foster independent thought, and ask the right questions. Through our work as a thinking school, we will embrace a common language of thinking and a common toolkit of resources. We will explicitly make thinking visible across the curriculum and enable pupils to take greater ownership of their learning. Pupils will be encouraged to embrace the challenge of thinking, become explicitly curious and independent in their learning, and to develop the academic resilience to approach any problem with confidence. It's a very grand vision statement, but it's one that we fully endorse, and that's what we're working towards. So I'd now like to hand over to Mr. Shaw, who will tell us a little bit about, actually, before I hand over Mr. Shaw, would you mind if I just race through this slide, giving the story so far as an introduction to you? So far, I've covered some of the background about what it means to be a thinking school and why we at Shiplake have chosen to focus on this work. So in terms of our story so far, we've looked at the science of learning, understanding of the brain and the optimal conditions for learning, and all teachers and staff have been introduced to this work. We've introduced thinking frames, which are the common tools, that pillar, which makes thinking visible, and Mr. Shaw will share some examples of those. And I've also mentioned the Shiplake 7, our common language to promote effective thinking and self-regulation. I'll add a bit more about that at the end. But without further ado, thank you very much, Mr. Shaw. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Oh, I think my camera has just failed me there. So sorry if this angle is not quite so good. Don't know quite why that is. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the science of learning. So I'll be sharing with you the same information that you have received from your the same information that your children will have received from us, and as Mr. Jones mentioned, the thinking frames as well. So at the beginning of last year, throughout the whole first term up until Christmas, every other week our teachers had a training session looking at the science of learning, what elements of psychology, of biology, of chemistry, of neuroscience are pertinent to teachers. So how the brain works, how we can strengthen neural pathways, the different types of thinking, and how we can maximize our attention and regulate our emotions. The idea being that if we understand these well, if we can communicate these to pupils so they become aware of the ways that they think, you're better able to regulate your own learning and gain that independent study ability. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. So how do we learn from a biological and psychological perspective? Well, we learn everything through our senses, and that doesn't mean we have to directly experience them ourselves. When we read, we are experiencing through our senses. We're taking that information in through our eyes. When we're in lessons, we're taking it in from our ears, our smells. Everything is feeding in. And that information is passed through our senses and to our central nervous system, which consists of our brain and our spinal cord. The brain contains millions and millions and millions of neural networks, and every time you are learning something that links to a familiar network, you're firing those connections, and every time those connections get fired, they start becoming thicker branches. And not only do they become thicker branches, they become denser branches. We get all of these new connections start forming in those areas, which essentially represent the new learning that takes place. Now, this is often referred to as neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change and adapt in response to the environment and experience. In other words, neuroplasticity is the biological foundation of learning, and areas of the brain will become physically larger, physically denser when they become used. An example of this was Einstein, actually. When Einstein died, there was a bit of a battle over his brain. And when they did an autopsy, there was one area that was much denser and more physically developed than the rest. It was the part that controlled his left hand, because he was a violinist and he had been studying since he was a child. And using that area again and again and again and again and again, having to think and having to control that motor area meant that that brain, part of the brain, needed more connections. That means it becomes automatic. Okay, so when parts of the brain are used, when connections are constantly revisited, it increases the speed and the efficiency with which information can be gathered from that region of cells. For example, things that you've been doing all the time in your jobs, you're probably much more able to talk about than things perhaps from 5-10 years ago that you haven't revisited. The things that are constantly being repeated, we're much more certain with. That's why teachers hate it when there are spec changes. It's much harder for us to be able to quickly answer our pupils' questions when some of that content is newer to us. This has often been described with this metaphor about walking through a woods. So if you go to a National Trust park, you'll follow these lovely paths, but every now and then you might notice that there are kind of areas that maybe people have started walking down, but they're certainly not as well trod. You can think of some areas of your brain and your learning like this. There are paths that you've traveled down many times, and they've become superhighways, areas where you can constantly get the information, the 2 times table, as quick as you like. But when you're learning something new, you're stepping off that beaten path for the first time. And that means the second time you walk down it, it might even be impossible or hard to find. We might say, oh, we only learnt this last lesson, but that's the first time you ever veered off this national park trail. You've got to find that exact point at which you left it. But if you revisit that, you'll tread that path, and eventually it'll become a dirt track. Then it might become a beaten path on which you've poured lots of wood chip before you pave it. But if you constantly revisit it, it can become this super highway, this ability for you to very quickly and efficiently get the information you need. And that's what happens with repetition in learning. This is essentially what we mean by neuroplasticity. Now, the importance of learning this is when students understand that repetition makes things quicker, that can really help improve confidence. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is all a little bit obvious, isn't it? We all know if you revise, things become quicker and easier, but that doesn't mean you automatically do it. Well, there's an additional advantage of knowing this information. It actually explains why learning is hard. It doesn't only explain why it becomes easy. When you are learning new things, you haven't yet formed those connections. It's very difficult to consistently and accurately retrieve that information. The learning pit. When we start off fresh. We're linking things to our previous understanding. We feel like we understand them. We feel like we are able to follow and apply it. But as we start learning more and more new things at a faster pace, we find it really difficult. But knowing about neuroplasticity, knowing that this is a biological fact, it's right that you're finding it hard. It's completely normal that you're not remembering it. It's only through this repetition that we'll all be doing together that we're going to feel better about it, that we're going to be more capable. It's really effective to be able to explain that to our learners and explain that this is a biological process behind it. Now, there's another reason that learning can become scary, and this is by understanding your emotional brain. Now, your prefrontal cortex, this lovely bit at the front of your brain, and the kind of the T-cozy that is the rest of your cerebral cortex, is involved in complex thinking. And as human beings, we're lucky enough to have some of the most developed and impressive cerebral cortexes, which you can see in this image is the bit that surrounds it. But this part of the brain surrounds a much, much older part of the brain, sometimes referred to as our reptilian brain. And this is the central part, and this controls our emotion. This early part of the brain exists in most animals as well, and it's responsible for a lot of our impulses. Fortunately, the limbic system can be remembered as a sort of cave brain with this handy acronym. So the limbic system is responsible for cooperation. So humans have always sought optimal cooperation in order for hunting and protection. It wants to regulate our activity. We want to preserve calories. We want to make sure that we're only doing what we need to. It's responsible for our fight or flight response. You know, our ability to stand up to the challenge of new encounters or to run away from threats. And it's also about efficiency, so not wasting activity. Now, when we take this idea, what's really important to understand is that your limbic system develops to maturity much, much quicker than your prefrontal cortex. So the part of your brain that you use for learning, the part of your brain that you use to evaluate concepts, to think about things, to apply things, to really understand things, doesn't finish developing until you're about 35. Whereas the limbic system becomes very well developed by about the age 18 to 20. That doesn't mean you have excellent emotional maturity by 18 to 20, because it's your prefrontal cortex, this later developing part of the brain, that is responsible for controlling and regulating the impulses from our limbic system. So when we tie that into the fact that we know learning can be difficult, and that's part of neuroplasticity, students understanding that it's a normal response to challenge, to run away from it, to not feel that you should throw absolutely everything into it, to not waste that efficiency, is a really normal element. And in education, we call this the window of vulnerability, the gap where the limbic system is pretty dominant and the prefrontal cortex is developing. Now, all of this is subject to individual differences. Some students are able to do this much earlier than others, but it's all about explaining how this is normal, and understanding how you respond to challenges can help you try and mitigate some of those effects. So understanding our limbic system would help us realize that we tend to take, students and us tend to take the path of least resistance, the easier option. We might avoid challenges in order to avoid those threats to us. And we worry, the sea of cave cooperation, about the group's perception of us and how we fit in. So it can all be quite a hostile environment, but understanding this really helps us to mitigate those effects. And we can see here the classic anxiety curve, the Yerkes-Dodson's law, that when our arousal increases, so does our performance, but that it only gets to an optimal point. Okay, so we need to feel a little bit anxious in order to perform well, but if it passes that point, then we see impairments and concentration and memory. Now, the other really key theory that I want to talk to you, and this is going to really link on to the common tools that Mr. Jones mentioned, the thinking frames, is understanding cognitive load. Now, there are two main types of cognitive load. You've got intrinsic load and extraneous load. Intrinsic load, if you take any task you're doing, listening to me now, what I'm talking to you about, the content of what I'm saying, is the intrinsic load. Okay, it has its own difficulty that is inherent with the information. So me talking at you through all through this information, me explaining these examples, has an intrinsic load. That's how difficult the task is. And your brain needs to apply a certain amount of attention to that intrinsic load. But there's also extraneous load. Now, if I were talking to you without this presentation and you were having to remember everything I said just as I said it without these cues to fall back on, the extraneous load would ratchet up, because the way the task is being presented has an impact on your ability to understand it. Extraneous load are external factors which take up space in our attention, in our memory, such as talking or distractions or being around your friends. The way I think about cognitive load is thinking about it as having 5 bars of battery. The more bars you can give to a task, the better you'll be able to do it. If you can give all of the bars of battery to the intrinsic load, the task itself, the maths questions, you're going to be able to do it. If there are lots of distractions or things around you that are adding to extraneous load, maybe it's in a language you don't understand or using really difficult terminology. Maybe you just hate the font, or you really struggle with hearing what's being said, then you're having to dedicate some of those bars of battery to simply interpreting the information around the task, and that reduces the efficiency on the task itself. And so cognitive load is a really useful way of understanding how we're able to pay attention to things and how that has an effect. And an example I'll give you here is driving. When you're learning to drive, there's a reason that your instructor pulls over to tell you how to do a maneuver. There's a reason the first time you did a roundabout, you didn't learn about it as you were approaching the roundabout. You stopped, learnt the theory before you had a go at it, because paying attention to that intrinsic load of what your driving instructor is telling you, whilst also paying attention to speeding traffic, reduces your ability to pay attention. And so by carrying these things through, applying this to our learning, making sure that the extraneous load is reduced, our pupils are able to spend more time on the task itself and the intrinsic difficulty of it. And how we do this is through thinking frames. So I've talked to you a bit about the science of learning and what our students and our teachers have had to learn about. These are the techniques and the tools that we're using to reduce extraneous load. Now, a thinking frame is simply a visual representation of 8 common thinking processes. And these thinking processes are defining, describing, comparing, breaking things down into their parts, sequencing, categorizing, establishing cause and effect, connecting, and I've gone through all of them there. I miscounted. And these help you to take the same approach. So all of our teachers and our pupils have been trained in these, and teachers, where they can, are delivering content using a thinking frame. It won't always be the appropriate way to do it, but if there's a task that can be done with a thinking frame, we will use it. The purpose of this is, as students are exposed across all of their different lessons to the same tools, the same techniques, they no longer have to spend time understanding the instructions of a task, and instead can focus on the information and the learning in and of itself. So my pupils might groan when I initially show them a defining task, but I have to spend next to no time explaining what they need to do. They know that they need to define the thing in the center. If I put a cause and effect chart on the board, they know immediately what it is they have to do without me describing and explaining the form itself and the instructions around it. They simply know how to interpret these visual cues because of that level of exposure. So I've included here some examples that our teachers have been using and some examples that have been created by pupils. So this is a categorization frame. This is where our pupils have to identify and break down into different categories, different types of molecules. In psychology, that might be different theories. In English, that might be different authors or different media. Here's an example that's on a much more creative subject, just to demonstrate how these are universal and can be applied across broad things. This is a defining frame. This photography class are looking at pattern in architecture, and what they've had to do is they've had to put into this defining frame all of the examples, all of the features they know about pattern, and then examples that they can to support it. So we can see this has been done with images because it's a really creative subject. That's the media for photography, but also the key terms that are needed around it. This is what we call a sequencing frame. This is really helpful for putting information into order, to understanding a chain of events and how they all work. Now, one of the things I like about this example is that you can see that Around this content, we have what's called the thinking lens. And here we ask questions about the information that's in the middle. So we're not only looking at the content, we're able to examine it by pulling things out of it. This we can see is where in this one it's from drama. So we're looking at context to set the scene in relation to the play, and it sequences the cause of the chain of events that people need to follow in order to understand that set design. These thinking frames have become so embedded among our teachers and our pupils that you don't need clever formatting, you don't need to use the Thinking Frames app, you don't need to spend hours redesigning these. You can sketch them quickly on a board. They're all very simple, deliberately very simple, so that you can recognize these and recreate these on paper, on boards, on whiteboards, on computers, whatever it is. So this was in a sociology lesson where they have been given an idea about this research by goal. They have to identify the cause that went into creating that goal and what the effects of that were. And so they can see the additional supporting facts that they have to add around the outside. All of this has just become so automatic when they're familiar with it. And it can also apply directly to essay writing. So this is an example from one of my own lessons. So this was a psychology, and the sequence, essentially the chain of events of writing good evaluations. You make a point, you support it with evidence, you explain it, and pupils have to put that information in a logical order with those sentence starters. That means no matter what subject you're doing, you're able to understand how to use a sequence of events in forming your writing. So that has been the common science of learning, what all of our pupils need to know in order to understand how they learn, and a range of tools that help them apply it to their very own learning. And I will pass back to Mr. Jones, who will tell us about some of the habits of mind and how this fits in with our Shiplake 7.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shaw. Very interesting. We are nearly there, everybody. I've just got one final section to talk about our common language, and then I'll tell you about the next steps. And then we'd invite any questions or comments you might have using the Q&A facility. I do hope that that works for you. But earlier I mentioned the Shiplake 7, our 7 characteristics of a successful learner, or our desirable learning behaviours. And these are well established at Shiplake College, and in some ways we were ahead of the game with our work as a thinking school because we already had a framework like this in place. However, through the work of the Drive team and Thinking Matters, we re-evaluated our Shiplake 7 with reference to the habits of mind. I'll show those in a moment. And there's a natural crossover with both the Shiplake 7s and the habits of mind, and we are looking now to embed this as the common language of our classroom. This is our current piece of work. The habits of mind are firmly rooted, I think it's on the next slide, please. Thank you, Mr. Shaw. They're firmly rooted in the research of Art Costa from the early 80s, and they are the 16 most effective habits or traits based on an observation of what makes some people more successful than others. And if you can identify what makes people successful, you can emulate it. And this is relevant in any scenario, of course. And for us, we will look at it in terms of successful learners. And as I mentioned, this will become our language of the classroom. Let's briefly look at each of the 16. And it's like one of those self-improvement posts you come across on Instagram. It's a useful reminder to us all. So it's of the 16: persisting, sticking with it, managing impulsivity, a wonderful link to the reptilian brain that Mr. Shaw mentioned earlier. Listening and understanding with empathy, thinking flexibly, thinking about your thinking, metacognition, we came across that earlier, of course, striving for accuracy, questioning, problem posing, and applying past knowledge to new situations or using previously created links in our brain. Number 9 will be, thank you, Mr. Shaw, I need your help with this. Be able to skip through, please, Mr. Shaw. I don't know them off by heart yet. Thank you so much. Thinking and communicating with clarity and precision, being clear, gathering data, creating, imagining, innovating, responding with wonderment and awe, becoming intrigued. There's a natural fit there with our curious, our emphasis on curiosity in the Shiplake 7. Taking responsible risks, finding humour, thinking interdependently, working together, cooperating with others, and remaining open to continuous learning, so learning throughout one's lifetime. So as I mentioned, there's a natural crossover with our Shiplake 7, and we're now exploring how we can embed this across the college. And some of the ways we will look to do this include making it the language of the classroom. We will shortly have posters displayed in every single classroom, which we'd expect teachers and pupils to refer to. It'll become the language of our reports. For the previous progress review, pupils were provided with sentence starters and a scaffolding using this language to write their very own pupil comment. It'll be covered in tutor resources in tutor time. We'll explicitly train the pupils in this. We'll introduce a habit of the week, both in college, and it may well come in the weekly bulletin as well, so you can have those conversations with your children. And obviously our weekly assembly is a wonderful opportunity to reinforce this work. So it'll be the language of metacognition and self-regulation. That's the important remaining part of our pillar. And finally, in terms of next steps, these are very clear to us. We will look to make this work as visible as possible for the remainder of this academic year and beyond, hence this talk for parents this evening. There are already thinking frames displayed in each classroom, and we'll now begin the work of embedding the common language I just mentioned across all subject areas. We're also about to start the formal process of accreditation with the University of Exeter. They'll assess our work and hopefully confer the status of accredited thinking school to Shiplake College. And thirdly, it's a long-term project. And we have to ensure that this work becomes embedded in our own culture. Mr. Shaw and I have visited some thinking schools, and the most effective schools are years into their journey. It does take time. However, we remain committed to this because we feel it'll have a tremendous benefit and has tremendous value on the learning and outcomes of our pupils. So before we take questions, I do hope that this overview of our work with Thinking Matters has been useful. And I also hope that we can all agree that this is an exciting development on the academic life of Shiplake College. This work is completely pupil-centred, and we all want to secure the best possible outcomes for our pupils. I know that we will prepare them as best we can using this approach for the challenges that they will face beyond Shiplake. And as I mentioned earlier, there are already examples of this across the college, and by sharing this common language and common toolkit of resources, we can ensure that we establish this culture of metacognition and this culture of academic achievement. So whilst Mr. Shaw continues to battle with his camera, it seems, we'd be very open to taking questions or comments if you would like to use the question and answer facility. Like in any classroom, who will be first? It's that cave brain again, isn't it? The fear of what others might think. If there are no questions this evening, we will be delighted to answer any questions you may have. Please feel free to reach out to us directly on email. And please be assured that if you missed anything or would like to revisit any parts of this, this recording will be shared in the weekly bulletin in due course. So in the absence of any questions, can I thank Mr. Shaw for his time, and can I thank you for joining us this evening, and I hope that's been very useful. Thank you very much. Goodbye.